July 3, 1943, 02:47 hours, northern sector of the Kursk salient, Soviet Union. Oberst Walter Hörnlein, commander of the Grossdeutschland Panzer Regiment, watched through his Zeiss binoculars at the dark horizon where he knew the Soviets were waiting. At 41 years old, a veteran of Poland, France, and 2 years on the Eastern Front, Hörnlein had seen enough war to recognize when something was terribly wrong. Behind him, lined up in formations that stretched as far as the eye could see, waited 777 German tanks, including 147 of the new Panzer V Panthers and 90 of the monstrous Panzer VI Tiger I. "They're waiting for us," he murmured to his second-in-command, Major Franz Beck. "They know exactly where we're going to attack, when we're going to attack, and with what we're going to attack." Beck, whose face showed the scars of 2 years of combat in the East, nodded silently. Both knew the truth that no one in the high command wanted to admit. Operation Citadel, the offensive that Hitler had promised would change the course of the war in the East, was doomed before it began. At that moment, 180 kilometers to the south, Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the man who had saved Moscow and destroyed the Sixth Army at Stalingrad, walked the Soviet defensive lines with a satisfaction he rarely allowed his subordinates to see. "Let them come," he told General Pavel Rotmistrov, commander of the 5th Guards Tank Army. "We've prepared 8 defensive lines. We've planted 503,663 mines. We have 20,220 artillery pieces waiting for them. And when their panzers sink into our defenses, we'll drown them in steel." What was about to begin on the steppes of Kursk was not simply a battle. It was the clash of 2 military philosophies, 2 economic systems, 2 visions of the future. The Germans were betting everything on technological superiority and tactical skill. The Soviets trusted in strategic depth, superior intelligence, and the capacity to absorb punishment that would have destroyed any other army. In the next 2 weeks, 2.7 million men, 7,400 tanks, 4,400 aircraft, and 47,000 artillery pieces would face each other in the largest armored combat in human history. This is the story of how the Wehrmacht bet its future on a single card and lost, of how Soviet intelligence turned a German offensive into a death trap, of how the world's most advanced tanks were defeated by meticulous preparation and massive sacrifice, and of how, in the burning fields around a provincial Soviet city, the Third Reich lost its last chance for victory in the East. The genesis of Operation Citadel dates back to February 1943, when the Eastern Front stabilized after the Stalingrad disaster. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein had executed a brilliant counteroffensive that recaptured Kharkov and created a massive Soviet salient around the city of Kursk, projecting 200 kilometers into German lines. For German planners, this salient represented both a threat and an opportunity. A threat because from there the Soviets could launch offensives north or south, and opportunity because a pincer attack from north and south could encircle and destroy 5 complete Soviet armies. On April 15, 1943, Hitler signed Operations Order No. 6, which began with words that reveal his desperation. "This offensive is of decisive importance. It must succeed quickly and completely. It must give us the initiative for this spring and summer." The plan was simple in concept. General Walter Model's 9th Army would attack from the north, while General Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army would attack from the south. They would meet at Kursk, encircling the entire Central Front and much of the Soviet Voronezh Front. But between conception and execution stood time, and time was the luxury Germany didn't have. Von Manstein wanted to attack in May, when the spring mud had dried, but before the Soviets could fortify. Hitler insisted on waiting until the new Panther tanks were available. General Heinz Guderian, Inspector General of Panzer Troops, violently opposed the entire operation. In a stormy meeting on May 4th, Guderian told Hitler directly, "Why do we want to attack in the east at all this year? Whenever I think of this offensive, my stomach turns over." Hitler postponed the attack into June, then into July. Each day of delay was a gift to the Soviets, and the Soviets, thanks to the most effective espionage network of the war, knew exactly what to expect. The Red Orchestra, the Soviet spy network in Europe, had penetrated the German high command at levels that wouldn't be fully revealed until decades after the war. On April 8, 1943, just 7 days after Hitler approved the preliminary plan, Stalin received a complete report of the proposed operation, including tentative dates and axes of attack. But the most valuable source of Soviet intelligence wasn't a spy. It was German arrogance itself. The Germans assumed their communications, encrypted by the Enigma machine, were unbreakable. They didn't know that the British had broken Enigma in 1941 and were sharing ultra-intelligence with the Soviets through carefully disguised channels. By June 1943, the Soviets knew not only the general German plan, but the specific locations of divisions, attack schedules, and even the names of unit commanders. Marshal Zhukov, acting as coordinator of the Kursk fronts, proposed something radical. Don't attack first. Instead, allow the Germans to crash against meticulously prepared defenses, bleed them dry, and then launch massive counteroffensives when they were exhausted. Stalin, normally impatient for offensive action, agreed. The decision marked a turning point in Soviet strategic thinking. They had learned to think several moves ahead. Soviet preparation was staggering in scale. General Konstantin Rokovsky, commander of the Central Front that would face the northern attack, built 8 successive defensive lines extending 190 kilometers to the rear. Each line consisted of trenches, concrete bunkers, artillery positions, and massive minefields. Soviet engineers planted mines at densities of 1,500 per kilometer of front in some sectors. In total, more than 500,000 mines turned the Kursk steppes into the densest minefield ever created. Soviet artillery was positioned in depth with meticulously coordinated fire plans. Each battery had pre-registered targets, meaning they could begin firing with deadly accuracy within seconds. The Soviets also prepared something the Germans didn't expect, a preemptive artillery bombardment. If they could determine the exact moment of the German attack, they would strike first, disrupting the assault formations before they could begin. While the Soviets built the most formidable fortress ever seen, the Germans assembled the most powerful strike force they could muster. For the Ninth Army in the north, Model concentrated 335,000 men, 590 tanks, and 424 assault guns. For the 4th Panzer Army in the south, Hoth gathered 349,000 men, 1,100 tanks and assault guns. The Wehrmacht's elite formations were there. The SS divisions Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, Das Reich, and Totenkopf, the Grossdeutschland Panzer Division, multiple regular panzer divisions. The new tanks were impressive on paper. The Panther, with its high-velocity 75mm gun and sloped armor, could penetrate any Soviet tank at 2,000 meters. The Tiger I, with its legendary 88mm gun, was virtually invulnerable frontally and could destroy T-34s at ranges where the Soviets couldn't even respond. The Germans also deployed 89 Ferdinand assault guns, 65-ton monsters with 200mm armor and the same 88mm gun as the Tiger. But these super tanks had problems that German planners minimized. The Panthers suffered from chronic mechanical problems. Their transmissions failed, their engines caught fire, their steering systems broke. Of the 200 Panthers sent to the front, only 147 were operational on the day of attack. The Ferdinands, designed as tank destroyers, had no machine guns for close defense, an omission that would prove fatal. And all these vehicles consumed fuel at alarming rates at a time when Germany faced critical oil shortages. Lieutenant Otto Carius, a Tiger commander who would survive the war with 150 tanks destroyed to his credit, remembered the atmosphere before Kursk. "We knew something big was coming. They told us this offensive would change the war. But when we saw the aerial reconnaissance photographs of the Soviet defenses, line after line of fortifications stretching to the horizon, some of us began to wonder if anyone in the high command really understood what we were getting into." On the Soviet side, soldiers were also preparing, but with a determination born of 2 years of brutal war. Sergeant Alexander Bodnar, T-34 commander of the 5th Guards Tank Army, wrote in his diary on July 3, "The fascists are coming with their new tanks. They say they're invincible, but we also have something new. We know exactly where they're going to attack. We prepared every meter of ground. This time, we'll drown them in their own blood." The Soviets had concentrated massive forces. Rokossovsky's Central Front had 711,575 men, 5,128 guns and mortars, 1,785 tanks and assault guns. General Nikolai Vatutin's Voronezh Front had 625,591 men, 8,718 guns and mortars, 1,704 tanks and assault guns, and in reserve, ready to exploit any success, waited General Ivan Konev's Steppe Front with another 573,195 men and 1,639 tanks. On the night of July 4, 1943, Soviet intelligence achieved its greatest coup. Prisoners captured in reconnaissance patrols revealed that the attack would begin at 03:00 a.m. on July 5. Zhukov immediately ordered the preemptive bombardment. At 02:20, 600 Soviet guns opened fire simultaneously in the northern sector and 500 more in the south. German concentration areas, artillery positions, and command posts were hit by a deluge of steel. Lieutenant Karl Fuchs, artillery officer of the 7th Panzer Division, was at his command post when the bombardment began. "The world exploded, shells falling everywhere, the earth shaking like an earthquake, men screaming, vehicles on fire. We lost 14 guns before we could fire a single shot. That's when I knew the Russians knew we were coming." The preemptive bombardment didn't stop the German attack, but it disrupted it and caused significant casualties. More importantly, it confirmed to every German soldier what many already suspected: there was no surprise. The Soviets were waiting. At 03:30, after their own artillery bombardment, German panzer formations began advancing in both sectors. In the north, Model's 9th Army attacked on a 45-kilometer front. The 20th Panzer Division, 6th Infantry Division, and 9th Panzer Division formed the spearhead. They immediately encountered the minefields. Tanks exploded, tracks flew through the air, vehicles stopped while engineers desperately tried to clear lanes. Soviet artillery, pre-registered on these minefields, began falling with deadly precision. Lieutenant Karl Schäufler, Panzer IV driver, remembered, "We advanced maybe 200 meters before the tank in front of us hit a mine. Massive explosion. The turret flew 10 meters in the air. We stopped. Then the artillery fire started. Shells falling like rain. We couldn't advance, couldn't retreat. Just sit there and pray the next shell wouldn't hit us." German engineers worked heroically to clear lanes through the minefields, but it was slow and deadly work. The Soviets had placed mines in patterns that made clearing extremely difficult. Anti-tank mines mixed with anti-personnel mines, mines with pressure fuses next to mines with pull fuses, wooden mines that metal detectors couldn't find, and all the while, Soviet artillery kept falling. When the panzers finally broke through the first line of defenses, they encountered something they didn't expect: Soviet tanks buried up to the turret, acting as immobile bunkers. These dug-in T-34s and KV-1s were almost impossible to hit and could fire at advancing German panzers with relative impunity. Hauptmann Franz Baker, Panzer Battalion commander, reported, "We destroyed 23 Soviet tanks on the first day. Then we discovered that 19 of them were dug in and had already been abandoned. The Russians were using them as decoys, while their mobile tanks shot at us from the flanks." In the southern sector, Hoth's 4th Panzer Army had more initial success. The SS divisions, attacking with characteristic fanaticism, penetrated more deeply. Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, commanded by SS Brigadeführer Theodor Wisch, advanced 15 kilometers on the first day. Das Reich, under SS Gruppenführer Walter Kruger, advanced 12 kilometers. Totenkopf, commanded by SS Brigadeführer Hermann Priess, penetrated 10 kilometers. But these penetrations came at a terrible cost. SS Oberstführer Ernst Bachmann, Panther commander, described the combat. "The Russians didn't retreat, they fought for every meter. We'd destroy one position, another would appear behind it. We'd kill one tank, 3 more would appear. It was like fighting a hydra. And our Panthers kept breaking down. Of the 12 tanks in my company, only 4 were operational at the end of the first day, and only 1 had been hit by enemy fire. The others broke down on their own." The Ferdinands, the super tank destroyers that were supposed to be invincible, proved to be death traps. Without machine guns for close defense, they were vulnerable to Soviet infantry with explosive charges. Soviet soldiers, showing courage that bordered on suicidal, would crawl up to these armored monsters and place demolition charges on the tracks, exhausts, or any weak point they could find. Lieutenant Anatoly Kozlov, infantry platoon commander, described the tactic. "They told us these new German tanks were invincible. Fine, if you can't destroy them from the front, you destroy them from behind. We'd wait in foxholes, let them pass, then jump out and run at them. Yes, many of us died, but we also destroyed many German tanks. One Ferdinand is worth 20 Soviet soldiers. That's an exchange we can make all day." By July 6th, the second day of the offensive, the pattern was clear. The Germans were advancing, but slowly and at an unsustainable cost. In the north, Model had penetrated only 10 kilometers in 2 days, and his panzer formations were being bled white. In the south, Hoth had advanced further, but was far from achieving the breakthrough he needed, and the Soviets kept bringing up reinforcements. General Vatukin, commander of the Voronezh front, was executing a masterful defense. Every time the Germans penetrated one defensive line, they found another behind it. Every time they destroyed one Soviet formation, another appeared to replace it. The Soviets were trading space for time, and time for German blood. It was an equation Germany couldn't win. On July 7th, Hitler began to have doubts. Reports from the front were troubling. High casualties, slow advances, massive mechanical problems with the Panthers. But field commanders insisted they were on the verge of breakthrough. Just one more push, just one more penetration, and the Soviet defenses will collapse. Hitler, against his better judgment, allowed the offensive to continue. In the northern sector, Model was reaching the conclusion that he couldn't advance further. His panzer formations had been reduced by half. He had penetrated only 12 kilometers in 3 days and was still 60 kilometers from Kursk. Worse, intelligence reported that the Soviets were concentrating massive forces in front of him. On July 10th, Model recommended stopping the offensive in his sector. Hitler, also facing the Allied invasion of Sicily, agreed. But in the south, Hoth believed he was on the verge of success. His SS divisions had penetrated 35 kilometers and were approaching the town of Prokhorovka. German intelligence reported that if they could take Prokhorovka, the road to Kursk would be open. What German intelligence didn't know was that Zhukov had been waiting for exactly this moment. He had kept in reserve General Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army, 850 fresh tanks, for specifically this moment.
On July 11th, Rotmistrov received his orders: attack the SS divisions at Prokhorovka and destroy them. That night, 850 Soviet tanks moved into attack positions around Prokhorovka. The Germans, exhausted after a week of continuous combat, didn't detect the movement. The stage was set for the largest tank clash in history. July 12, 1943, dawned hot and humid. A storm during the night had turned the fields around Prokhorovka into mud, but by 8 o'clock the sun had begun to dry the ground. SS Obersturmbannführer Rudolf von Ribbentrop, commander of the Leibstandarte tank battalion and son of the German foreign minister, was eating black bread and ersatz coffee when he heard the sound. It was like distant thunder, he would recall later, but the sky was clear. Then someone shouted, "Panzer! Panzer!" and we looked east. The entire horizon was filled with Soviet tanks, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all coming straight at us. At 8:30, Rotmistrov launched his attack. 850 Soviet tanks, mainly T-34s, but also some heavy KV-1s and the new T-34-85s, charged across the wheat fields toward German positions. The Soviet tactic was simple and brutal: close the distance as fast as possible. The German Tigers and Panthers had a massive advantage in range. They could destroy T-34s at 2,000 meters. But at 200 meters, the T-34's 76mm gun could penetrate even a Tiger from the sides or rear. German gunners began firing at extreme ranges. SS Unterschargführer Franz Staudager, Tiger commander, described the scene. "I fired my first shot at 1,800 meters. Direct hit. The T-34 exploded. Second shot, another hit. Third shot, another. But they kept coming. For every one we destroyed, 2 more appeared. It was like trying to stop an avalanche with a pistol." The Soviets accepted horrific losses to close the distance. Dozens of T-34s were destroyed in the first minutes, becoming burning torches in the wheat fields. But the survivors kept coming, and when they reached close range, the German advantage disappeared. At 200 meters, a T-34 could kill a Tiger. At 100 meters, it could kill anything. The combat disintegrated into chaos, with individual tanks fighting at point-blank range. German and Soviet tanks fired at each other at distances of 50 meters or less. Some tanks collided with each other. Infantry from both sides fought in the spaces between tanks. Smoke from hundreds of burning vehicles obscured the battlefield, making it impossible to distinguish friend from enemy beyond a few meters. Lieutenant Anatoly Kozlov, whose infantry platoon was supporting the tank attack, remembered, "It was hell on earth. Burning tanks everywhere, men screaming, constant explosions. I saw a T-34 ram a Panther. Both tanks exploded. I saw a Tiger destroy 3 of our tanks in 10 seconds, then get hit by 2 more from the sides. The noise was deafening. You couldn't think, only react." Staudager, the Tiger commander, found himself surrounded by T-34s. We were in the middle of them. We fired in all directions. My gunner destroyed a T-34 at 30 meters, so close the debris hit our tank. Another T-34 shot us from behind. The shell bounced off our rear armor. We shot back, destroyed it. I lost count after 10 tanks. We just kept firing, reloading, firing again. By noon, the battlefield was a graveyard of steel. More than 400 tanks, German and Soviet, were burning or lay destroyed. The smoke was so dense that aircraft couldn't see the ground.
Combat continued throughout the afternoon, but gradually the intensity decreased as both sides ran out of operational tanks and ammunition. When the sun set on July 12th, both sides claimed victory. The Germans had destroyed more Soviet tanks, perhaps 300 against 80 of their own, but the Soviets had achieved their objective, stopping the German advance. The SS divisions, which had begun the day commanding the Grossdeutschland Panzer Regiment, ended the day commanding what remained of the entire division after its commander was wounded. In his final report he wrote, words that captured the reality many German officers now understood, but few dared say aloud. We have lost the initiative in the east and will never recover it. The Russians are too strong, too numerous, and now they've learned to fight as well as we do. Every day this war continues, we grow weaker and they grow stronger. I don't see how we can win. Guderian, the father of German panzer forces, was even more direct in his post-war memoirs. With the failure of Citadel, we lost the initiative on the Eastern Front decisively. From then on, the initiative was in Russian hands. There were no more periods of calm in any sector of the Eastern Front. The Russians kept us under constant pressure along the entire front, and their attacks increased in strength and tactical skill. For the Soviets, Kursk was confirmation that they had mastered the art of modern war. They had defeated the Germans not through blind sacrifice that characterized 1941 and 1942, but through superior intelligence, meticulous preparation, strategic depth, and skillful use of reserves. Marshal Zhukov, in his memoirs, wrote, Kursk was the turning point. After Stalingrad, we knew we could stop the Germans. After Kursk, we knew we could destroy them. The psychological impact of Kursk on both armies was profound. For the Germans, the defeat destroyed the myth of panzer invincibility. Soldiers who had believed that German technological and tactical superiority would eventually prevail now saw a future of endless retreat. Lieutenant Karl Fuchs, the artillery officer who had experienced the Soviet preemptive bombardment, wrote to his wife, "We no longer believe in victory. We only hope to survive. The Russians are too many, too strong. Every day there are fewer of us and more of them." For the Soviets, Kursk generated a confidence that transformed the Red Army. Soldiers who had retreated for 2 years now knew they could not only stop but defeat the Wehrmacht in open battle. Sergeant Alexander Bodnar, the T-34 commander who had written in his diary before the battle, wrote afterward, "We said we'd drown them in their own blood, and we did. The fascists came with their best troops, their best tanks, their best plans. We shattered them. Now we're going to chase them all the way to Berlin." The battle also revealed the maturity of the Soviet weapons system. The T-34, which had been superior to German tanks in 1941, was now inferior to Panthers and Tigers in technical specifications. But the Soviets had learned to use their tanks en masse, accepting losses that would have been unacceptable to the Germans, knowing they could replace them. Soviet doctrine of deep operations, developed in the 1930s but poorly executed in 1941-42, was now being applied with mastery. Soviet artillery, always the Red Army's favorite weapon, had proven devastatingly effective. The Germans called Soviet artillery Stalin's hammer, and with good reason. The Soviet capacity to concentrate thousands of guns in narrow sectors, to coordinate fire from multiple divisions, to maintain sustained bombardments for hours was something the Germans couldn't match. At Kursk, Soviet artillery fired more than 2.5 million shells, a deluge of steel that shattered entire German formations. The Soviet Air Force, the VVS, had also matured. In 1941, the Luftwaffe had destroyed the VVS in the first days of the war. By 1943, the VVS was a formidable force. At Kursk, the Soviets flew 90,000 sorties, more than the Germans. Soviet pilots, flying Yak-9s, La-5s, and Il-2 Sturmovix, contested every meter of sky. German ace Erich Hartmann, who would become the most successful fighter pilot in history with 352 victories, most on the Eastern Front, remembered, "In 1941, we could fly wherever we wanted. By 1943, every mission was a fight. Soviet pilots had learned to fight." But perhaps the most important factor at Kursk was something that can't be measured in statistics: the will to fight. Soviet soldiers in 1943 were fighting for their invaded homeland, for their murdered families, for revenge against an enemy that had committed unimaginable atrocities. This motivation, combined with the growing professional competence of the Red Army, created a force the Germans simply couldn't defeat. The German soldier in 1943 was fighting for increasingly unclear reasons. The war of conquest had become a war of survival. Nazi ideology, which had motivated many in the early years, was being eroded by the reality of defeat. Obergefreiser Hans Schaufler, the panzer driver who had experienced the Soviet minefields, wrote, "I no longer know why we're fighting. They told us we were superior, that we'd win easily. But we've been retreating for a year. My friends are dead. For what? So Hitler can say we fought bravely? I'm tired of fighting bravely. I just want to go home." The strategic consequences of Kursk extended far beyond the Eastern Front. The defeat convinced many in the German High Command that the war was lost. General Heinz Guderian wrote, "After Kursk, we knew we couldn't win. The only question was how long we could hold out." This understanding led some officers to consider options that would have been unthinkable a year earlier, including the plot to assassinate Hitler that would culminate in the failed attempt of July 20, 1944. For the Western Allies, Kursk confirmed that the Soviets would not only survive, but win in the East. This affected planning for the invasion of France. Churchill and Roosevelt knew that if they delayed too long, the Red Army might reach Paris before them. The urgency of opening a second front in Western Europe increased dramatically after Kursk. For Stalin, Kursk was validation of his strategy of allowing the Germans to attack first. It was also validation of his command system. Unlike 1941, when he had disastrously interfered in tactical decisions, in 1943, Stalin had learned to listen to his marshals. Zhukov, Vasilevsky, Rokossovsky, and other Soviet commanders now had the freedom to plan and execute operations without constant political interference. This professionalization of Soviet command was as important as any weapon in defeating Germany. The battle also had a profound impact on the Soviet civilian population. News of the victory at Kursk, following Stalingrad, convinced millions that final victory was possible. Civilian morale, which had been sustained by pure determination during the dark years of 1941-42, was now reinforced by hope. Factories increased production. Workers accepted conditions that in peacetime would have been intolerable. Everyone knew that every tank, every shell, every bullet produced brought the day of victory closer. In Germany, the impact was the opposite. Goebbels tried to present Kursk as a successful strategic withdrawal, but few were fooled. The German population, which had celebrated victories for 4 years, now faced the reality of defeat. Casualty lists grew longer. Letters from the front became more somber. Propaganda about final victory sounded increasingly hollow. Germany's allies also took note. Italy, already invaded by the Allies in Sicily, would collapse in September 1943. Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria began secretly seeking ways out of the war. Finland, which had fought alongside Germany against the Soviet Union, began peace negotiations. The Axis bloc, which had seemed invincible in 1942, was crumbling. After Kursk, the war in the East became a series of relentless Soviet offensives. In August 1943, the Soviets liberated Kharkov. In September, they crossed the Dnieper. In November, they liberated Kiev. Each offensive pushed the Germans further west. Each battle cost the Wehrmacht forces it couldn't replace. The Red Army that had been on the verge of collapse in 1941 was now an unstoppable war machine that wouldn't stop until it reached Berlin.
Veterans of Kursk on both sides carried the scars of the battle for the rest of their lives. SS Unterscharführer Franz Staudegger, the Tiger commander who had destroyed dozens of Soviet tanks at Prokhorovka, survived the war, but never spoke publicly about his experiences until decades later. In a 1980 interview, he said, "People ask me how many tanks I destroyed at Kursk. I say 22 confirmed, probably more. Then they ask if I'm proud. Proud. I saw hundreds of men die, Germans and Russians. I saw the battlefield afterward, burning tanks as far as the eye could see, bodies everywhere. There's no pride in that, only horror." Lieutenant Anatoly Kozlov, the Soviet infantry platoon commander, was severely wounded at Prokhorovka and spent 6 months in hospital. He returned to the front in 1944 and fought all the way to Berlin. In his memoirs, published in 1975, he wrote, "Kursk was where we learned we could beat the fascists, not through blind sacrifice, but through skill, preparation, and courage. We lost many comrades there, but their deaths weren't in vain. Every German tank we destroyed, every fascist soldier we killed, brought the day of victory closer. Kursk was where the tide turned. After that, we knew we'd win." Oberst Walter Hörnlein, the Grossdeutschland commander, survived Kursk but was severely wounded in Ukraine in 1944. He spent the rest of the war in hospitals and was captured by the Americans in 1945. In his interrogation, Allied intelligence officers asked when he knew Germany would lose the war. His answer was simple: "Kursk. When I saw the Soviet defenses, when I saw how many tanks they had, when I saw that they knew exactly where we'd attack, I knew we'd lost. Not that battle, but the war. The Russians had learned to fight, and we no longer had the resources to win." Marshal Georgy Zhukov, in his memoirs Reminiscences and Reflections, was more measured but equally clear. "Kursk demonstrated that the Red Army had reached maturity. We had learned to defend in depth, to use strategic reserves, to coordinate all arms of combat. But more importantly, we had learned to think several steps ahead of the enemy. The Germans planned Citadel for months. We knew about it almost from the beginning and had months to prepare. When they attacked, we were waiting. That was the difference between victory and defeat." In the years after the war, military historians worldwide studied Kursk as an example of how intelligence, preparation, and strategic depth can defeat technological and tactical superiority. The battle became a case study in military academies. The principles demonstrated at Kursk, defense in depth, use of reserves, combined arms coordination, would influence military doctrine for decades. But for those who fought there, Kursk was more than a case study. It was the place where friends died, where innocence was lost, where the future of Europe was decided. The battlefield around Prokhorovka, where the largest tank clash in history took place, is now a memorial. Each year, surviving veterans, fewer and fewer, return to remember. In 1993, on the 50th anniversary of the battle, German and Soviet veterans met at Prokhorovka. A German veteran, whose name wasn't recorded, told a journalist, "We fought here 50 years ago. We were enemies. Many of us died. Now we're old, and the war ended long ago. But I'll never forget this place. Never forget the sound of the tanks, the smell of smoke, the screams of the wounded. War is hell, and this was the center of hell."
A Soviet veteran responded, "We fought for our homeland, for our families, for our future. The fascists came to enslave or kill us. We stopped them here. Yes, we paid a terrible price, but it was worth it. Look around. This field where so many died is now peaceful. Children play here. Wheat grows here. That's what we fought for. That's what our comrades died for." The Battle of Kursk was the clash of titans, the moment when two systems, two ideologies, two visions of the future met in mortal combat. The Germans bet everything on technological superiority, tactical skill, and the will of their elite soldiers. The Soviets trusted in superior intelligence, meticulous preparation, strategic depth, and their people's willingness to sacrifice everything for victory. In the burning fields around Kursk, in the blood-soaked steppes around Prokhorovka, in the smoke-filled skies over the salient, the future was decided. The Germans lost their last chance for victory in the east. The Soviets gained the initiative they would never relinquish. The road to Berlin was open, and it would take less than 2 years to travel it. When the last shot was fired at Kursk, when the last tank stopped, when the last soldier fell, the outcome of World War II was no longer in doubt. Hitler had bet everything and lost. Stalin had played a patient hand and won. And millions of soldiers on both sides had paid the price for their leaders' decisions.
The legacy of Kursk endures. It was the largest battle of the largest war in history. It was the moment when the tide turned irrevocably. It was the place where the Wehrmacht died and the Red Army was born as the most powerful military force in Europe. And it was a reminder that in war, as in life, it's not always the strongest or most skilled who wins. Sometimes it's the one who's best prepared, who thinks furthest ahead, who's willing to pay the price of victory. In the words of Marshal Zhukov, spoken on the 20th anniversary of the battle, Kursk was where we learned we could not only survive but prevail. It was where German fascism received a blow from which it never recovered. It was where the Soviet people proved that no enemy, no matter how powerful, can conquer a people fighting for their home, their freedom, and their future. That is the lesson of Kursk. That is the lesson the world must never forget.